Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of TCG Talk, back today with another video. And in today's video, as you can see on the screen, we are going to be doing an elemental breakdown in the Grand Archive TCG. We're going to be talking about Spirit of Wind, Spirit of Water, and Spirit of Fire. Talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each one, and hopefully help you be able to better pick an archetype that you enjoy and that you identify with, but also one that might go better with your champion, because it's a very important decision you have to make. And that's one thing I love about this game, is it has a lot of different room for archetypes, so hopefully I'll help you better understand those archetypes in today's video. But if you're new to the channel, welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by. Hopefully enjoy your stay. If you're a long-standing supporter, thank you so much as always. Feel free to check out the Discord down below. I'm making some more Grand Archive channels today. I'll be doing that, I promise, so we can have some more discussion on this game in there. For really quick, for the people in the Grand Archive community who responded to my first video the other day talking about my introduction of covering the game, thank you so much for the positive comments, especially in the Grand Archive Discord. Y'all are crazy. I didn't realize it would be that welcoming, so I really appreciate it. If you're watching this video, please feel free to add on in the comments of anything I may miss on certain elements, or anything that you agree with, disagree with. I would love to hear y'all's feedback, because everyone's growing the game, we're getting better together and having fun with it. Last note before I get into it, if you're new to my channel, and I'm gonna say this a couple times over the next couple videos just in case, because we're getting a lot of newer people, is I like to do discussion-based content like this. I like to have you feel like you're talking to a knowledgeable person at your local game store, or that you're talking to a friend at a local game store and just talking about the game. That's like the vibe I want to give, right? And also try to do pretty efficient content. I like to do like 10 to 15 minute videos typically. I don't like to go above or below that. So hopefully this is in-depth enough, but if I miss anything, please let me know. So we have Spirit of Wind, Spirit of Water, and Spirit of Fire. It's very important to understand what each archetype does, because when you start the game in your material deck, you're going to start turn one by basically revealing your spirit. You can have, I think, multiple spirits in a material deck technically, but it's really hard to do that. But basically, you're going to pick an archetype, right? That's going to eventually go underneath your champion, and it identifies what cards you can play, right? If you're playing, Rai, who's a mage human, when you get to level 3, you have access to arcane cards, right? And you have access to normal cards and other cards, but you only can play the element that you choose. So if you choose to be a fire Rai, you only can play fire cards, right? If you have a fire spirit, you can't play water cards, right? Unless there's some other way to break that through the rules of the game, which there's only a couple choice ways of being able to get around elemental lock. So basically, it's really important to understand this, because it's going to change how you structure your deck, right? Obviously, you're going to use more fire cards if you pick fire, but you're also going to have different strengths and weaknesses based off if you do a fire Rai versus a water Rai, right? So it's really important to understand what each element does. So we're going to go into it. The first one we're going to go into is wind. Wind is very how do I put this? Wind is very tempo based. I always have trouble discussing wind the most. Wind is very tempo based. It's very value driven. Some people might use the term mid range. I don't like that term in this game. I think this game, you can almost play every deck mid range if you want to, but it's very tempo based. It's very board state based. Has a lot of allies. Allies are probably the most prominent in wind, which is really important. But it also the whole general feel of wind is I'm using cards that are going to give me incremental value and not stunt what you're doing like a control deck, or completely inhibit you from playing your game. I'm just going to inhibit you from getting the maximum value from what you're trying to do. A perfect card like this example is Veiling Breeze. It's in the middle. It says reveal any amount of wind element cards from your memory until the end of turn. Whenever damage will be dealt to your champion, prevent the amount of damage equal to the amount of cards revealed this way. So you play Veiling Breeze, you pay 1 for it, right? Put it in your memory, and then you reveal 2 wind cards. You're going to prevent an instance of 2 damage on every source of damage that's dealt to you. So if you're playing against a go wide aggro deck, a Fire Xander deck, and you're able to, and he has 5 allies on the board, 4 allies on the board, and they all attack for 2, Veiling Breeze will literally block every instance of attack that's coming, pretty much, because they're all attacking for 2. Veiling Breeze is going to prevent 2 since you prevented 2 win cards, and it just really stunts what they're trying to do. Now, again, it doesn't necessarily like inhibit them from doing what they want to do, like water can, but it really slows them down, and it can really punish your opponent for trying to overextend. And it helps you buy time and gain that incremental value points until you're getting to whatever your win condition is. I think a lot of good level 3 decks go for wind, in my opinion, because wind gives you the tools to get to that point. Water does as well, but I think wind does it a little bit better, right? So that's kind of a big thing. Cards like Reclaim are really nice. If you have cards that have like on enter effects and then your opponent tries to attack them, you can reclaim it back to your hand and then be able to play it again. It also has some floating memory, which is nice. And then cards like Zephyr are also a very good example of, suppress a target ally or regalia to suppress an object, banish it, and return to the field under its owner's control at the beginning of their next end phase. So again, you're trying to stunt your opponent a little bit, get that incremental value, not let them filter through their deck as much, not let them be able to play as many cards, and be able to, eventually get to your later game and win. Again, allies is really big. One of the biggest ones, in my opinion, is Dream Fairy. I love Dream Fairy. It has stealth 1/2, and it says on enter, return target ally you don't control to its owner's memory. Opponents can't activate cards with that ally's name as long as you control Dream Fairy. So if someone has a really annoying ally on the board, you can bounce it to their memory with this card, and then they can't play it as long as Dream Fairy is in play, which is pretty nuts. So allies are really important for wind. There's multiple ways you can take it, but basically wind is a tempo and value based element that allows you to then play towards other win conditions. When it comes to weaknesses of wind, one of them, and I have notes here, so I'm kind of trying to like reference it, make sure I don't forget anything. It can be kind of general, I guess is the best way to put it. Wind, in my opinion, is the least thematic, because wind just really relies on good trading card mechanics, I guess is the best way to put it. So it can feel a little bit less thematic than like a water or a fire deck, in my opinion. You don't feel the element of wind as much. I mean, you do when you bounce stuff and do like manipulation, but just compared to the other two elements, I do think it is the least kind of thematic of the three, which can be a downside to some people. Some people really want to feel like they're doing whatever that element is. The other thing is deck building. Deck building is very difficult in wind, in my opinion. It's one of the hardest elements to kind of grasp on what you should be doing, right? How many allies do you have? How many, going back to those previous three, like how many of these control effect cards do you have? Do you run 2 Veiling Breezes because you're expecting a lot of aggro? Do you run 4? How many reclaims do you run? Because one thing you can do with wind, if you don't deck build properly, is either you just have a bunch of allies, but maybe you can't quite go as fast as like fire, or you have a bunch of control cards, but your opponent's not really forcing you to interact or anything like that. So you can have these weird ratios to where it can really hurt you. So you have to be really good deck builder, in my opinion, even more so with wind in order to make it work. And I think that's why a lot of people just go with the wind allies route and really focus on allies, because allies is a little bit easier to kind of conceptualize. The last thing we said about not being as thematic, the other thing is it can just be really kind of general. I know it kind of goes with thematic, but it can be general in terms of like what you're trying to do from a mechanics perspective and from a win condition perspective. So over the course of a big tournament, you could be getting a little bit fatigued with what you're trying to do. But overall, I enjoy wind. If you're a very big player when it comes to the mechanics of a card game and like incremental value, if you enjoy that tempo based feel when you're playing games and really use a lot of micro decisions to improve your position and beat your opponent, then I think wind's the best element for you. Personally, if you're a Flesh and Blood player watching this, wind is where you're going to feel most it's gonna click the most for you, because the way wind plays is the way that Flesh and Blood plays in terms of micro decisions and value and things like that. So that's wind. The next one is fire. So fire is the ultimate ask the question element in TCGs. You always hear ask the question, answer the question. Ask the question is a deck that's gonna say, hey, I'm doing this thing, you need to answer it, you need to stop what I'm trying to do, I don't care what you're doing, I'm gonna do this, and I hope you can do something about it. That's an ask the question deck. Answer the question is, okay, I have a lot of answers to what other people are trying to do, but I may not have as proactive of a game plan myself. I'm kind of being flexible with what my opponent's doing, stop them from what they're doing, and then play for something else. So Fire is the ask the question for sure. It's very strong early, but its downside is it's weaker late. So you have cards like Creative Shock, Cremation Ritual, and Hasty Messenger, cards that allow you to draw and discard, so you're filtering through while also dealing a lot of damage. Not a lot, but a decent amount of damage, and you're trying to filter and get to the cards you want to see very quickly because you're trying to end the game quickly. Fire decks want to end the game between turn 3 and 4, in my opinion. Typically, you can have some turn 2 kill decks, although I'd say turn 3, turn 4 is what they're looking for. Cards like Creative Shock say draw 2 cards and discard a card. Has a class bonus of saying if a fire element card was discarded, you may choose a unit and deal 2 damage to it. Cremation Ritual, similar, as an additional cost to activate this card, sacrifice an ally you control to draw 2 cards. So maybe you put in a really low 1/1 ally that had an on-enter effect, and then you sacrifice it, draw 2 cards, keep going. And Hasty Messenger, you may discard a card if you do draw a card when it attacks. So again, a lot of filter, a lot of chip damage, and getting just a lot of pressure to your opponent very, very quickly. It also has combo elements in it, which allows you, it cares a lot about its grave. Fire, I think even more so than most elements, cares a lot about its grave and what's in its grave. So cards like Fiery Momentum that say this gets +1 for each fire element card in your graveyard. So, you do all these draw discard effects with Cremation Ritual, Hasty Messenger, and Creative Shock, and then you have, let's say, 8 fire cards in your grave, and then you play Fiery Momentum for 10. 3 for 10 because it gets +1 for each element, each fire element card in your graveyard. So if you have 8 fire cards in your grave, and you play this, all of a sudden it gets +8, and you can really combo them out. Rending Flames is on the other side of that combo that says on attack, you may banish 3 fire element cards from your graveyard. If you do, Rending Flames gains whenever this attack would deal damage, it deals double that damage instead. So it comes in for 6, but then you can buff it with other things so it can get even higher. Again, Fire cares about its graveyard, it cares about filtering, and it cares about giving a lot of pressure. The downside to Fire, like I said earlier, is it kind of is weaker in the late game. If you can answer what Fire is trying to do, they can literally burn out. That's no pun intended, or I guess all pun intended, on burning out. So when you're the Fire player, the onus is on you to try to win the game, because if you can't, or the onus is on you to win the game quicker, because if you can't, you can really stun out and not be able to close out. And the other thing about Fire is it doesn't have a lot of defensive tools. It doesn't have cards like you saw earlier with Reclaim and Valiant Breeze. It's all gas, no brakes. There are obviously a couple defensive cards, but typically a Fire deck is just going to be trying to kill the opponent. So Minor Protection is another downside to Fire. The last kind of downside to Fire that I have noticed is lack of floating memory. So in this game, when you play cards from your material deck, some of them may cost something. And so you have to pay the reserve cost for that equipment piece, right? And some of them do cost 0, but if it costs 1, then you have to either A, banish a random card from your memory, which again, go check out the main deck. Main deck games is how to play and understand how memory works. But if you don't have floating memory in your graveyard, then you have to literally go down a card in terms of card advantage in order to play that said materialization. So having floating memory on a card means if that card goes to graveyard and you want to pay for a material deck cost, you can banish that card with the floating memory to pay for it. So if something costs 1, you have 1 floating memory, it allows you to pay for basically that materialization for free. That's very important when it comes to card advantage, because if, let's say I'm going to a level 3 like Tristan above me, if you see her little blue dot says 3 cost, that means I have to either pay 3 cards from my memory in my recollection phase, which means I go down 3 cards in card advantage, or I play 3 cards with floating memory. And so with Fire not having access to floating memory, you'll often see Fire decks only go to level 1 or 2 because they don't have the card advantage to be able to pay for those higher cost materializations, which again puts them on a clock more to win the game because they don't get access. Not that they don't normally go into getting access to those level 3 abilities unless you're playing a Fire, Luxem, Xander, something like that. So that's kind of the downside. So upsides of Fire is it asks the question, it forces the opponent to do something because it's going to have a very proactive game plan of trying to kill them quick. It's very strong early in the late game, in the early game it applies a lot of pressure, and it has combo elements in it like Rending Flames, Fire Momentum, things where you can just one-shot your opponent once you chip them down a little bit. Its weaknesses: it has lesser floating memory, so materializations can be a little bit trickier. You have to be a lot careful. It has minor protection as compared to water and wind, and it can burn out. If your opponent does have the ability to stunt you, has the ability to prevent damage, slow you down, you can just lose out of the game like that. So it all depends on how you want to approach it. And then we have water. Water, like in most card games with blue, is very control-oriented. It has a lot of control effects, but not just like, in other card games, control effects might just be bouncing stuff or, completely negating or completely destroying. It does have those elements in this game as well, but what I also love about this is it has a lot of reduction and a lot of memory, or like mana, I guess is the best way to put it, resource manipulation. So reduction is really big in this game, being able to reduce the damage and continuously reduce the damage, being able to negate certain things and being able to stunt certain things. Fracturize is probably one of the most popular control cards in blue. Target item or weapon becomes a cleric fractal fantasia with reservable and loses all other abilities. So basically you're able to like take out someone's weapon like out of the game pretty much for the most part. Fracturize is very, very good. Frostbite is also another one. Negate target card activation unless its controller pays 2. Banish the card that has its activation negated this way, so you're able to stop an target activation. And then Scepter of Lumina, which is a proxy vault card. As long as each player controls a water element champion, you may activate this card from your material deck. Whenever your champion levels up, deal 4 damage to target champion you don't control. This one's a little bit more offensive, but regardless, the difference between water and wind, because I did say wind had control elements, right, is wind's control effects are more like incremental value and tempo and like not stopping the opponent from what they want to do, but more so like, slowing them down while you're playing for something, whereas water is like literally stopping them, right? Being able to negate them, being able to choke their memory a little bit so they can't level up, like actually stopping that opponent's game plan, where wind is just saying, I'm going to protect myself from your game plan, if that makes any sense at all. So that's kind of where the control elements differ. Water also has a lot of self-mill, especially with Nico now, either self-mill to help kind of grow what you're trying to do, or you can be milling your opponent as well. Milling now is, I think, a viable strategy, especially with some of the assassin cards that just got revealed. Both Assassin and Guardian can kind of go into that mill game plan. Nico, or I think now, personally, I think Tristan has that option as well. So that's kind of where that is. Another thing that water has access to, unlike fire, is floating memory access. Water is able to go into those level 3s very easily because they have access to a lot of cards with floating memory. This is very important because typically in a water deck, in my opinion, from what I've seen, even like water allies, going into level 2, level 3 is very common. You want to do that because you want to be able to, you're controlling your opponent till you play to these late game effects. And so having access to this floating memory really allows you to do that a lot easier while still enacting your game plan. They won't go down as much in terms of card advantage until they get to where they want to be. So as you can see, all of these have floating memory, and they're all like different archetypes. You have Assassin, Guardian, Warrior, and Mage. So no matter what champion you're playing, you're going to have access to a pretty good amount of floating memory. And then finally, water answers the question, right? Like fire asks the question, water has a lot of answers to what you're trying to do, to stop you what you're trying to do, and so on and so forth. When it comes to the downsides of water, in this game specifically, and I think honestly Mortal Ambition is going to change this surprisingly a little bit, but it's still, I think, a weakness, is water sometimes lacks a win condition, in my opinion, or struggles to really have a strong win condition at times. The win condition seems like it can be very linear, and not in terms of playing cards attacking, but in terms of like if you stop the one culminating win condition that water's trying to do, they can really have a hard time closing out the game. And when you're in a game where in a competitive environment, it's a best of 3 and like I think it's an hour. Please correct me in the comments below. I haven't really looked a ton at that, but I do know it's a best of 3 in a certain amount of time. I'm pretty sure it's either 50 minutes or an hour. If you're playing a deck that stops the opponent from doing what they want to do, but can sometimes struggle closing out games, you can get in the situation where maybe you could get ties or not be able to, win your round, which could be really bad. Now, it's not so bad that water is not playable. It's just a certain thing. And I do think out of all the elements, water's probably seen the least competitive play, if I'm I hope I'm right on that. I'm pretty sure I'm right on that from what I've seen in big tournaments. It's not that it's unplayable. It's just it's the hardest to make work at the top tables. So that's kind of one thing. Another thing is identity. I did say wind can be general, but water can lack an identity a little bit when it comes to like what you're trying to do. That it kind of goes hand in hand with the win con, but like you have to really pick certain. The one thing about this game that I really enjoy, even compared to more so than other trading card games, is you can really pick a card and be like, I want to build around this card. Like me looking down at my desk right now, it's full of Grand Archive cards. You have Planar Abyss from, this is a win card from the new set, where you can deal a ton of damage to a champion, but it's a level 3 card. And I could say like, okay, I want to run 3 of these, and I'm gonna build my entire deck on being able to like play to this win condition. Water sometimes lacks that when it comes to like playing to a certain win condition or just having an identity in general. Sometimes it just seems like you're just annoying your opponent, which some people love doing, but it is a little bit odd sometimes. The last thing that's hard with water, like every control deck, is complexity. There's a lot of chances for you to hang yourself up. Water is an element where if you make 1 or 2 key mistakes, it probably costs you the game. So you have to really be, pointed and careful with what you're doing in order to make the most of your decisions and be able to close out the game. Because if you have a deck that has, not as strong of a win condition, or maybe a very narrow win condition, and you screw up the ability to get to that, then what are you doing? Because you don't have the pressure like fire does. You don't have the incremental value or late game value potentially like wind does. So you have to really make the most of all of your tools in your toolbox in order to win with water. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. So overall, if you wanted me to kind of give you like a last synopsis, wind is very tempo and mid-rangey tempo, value based with allies, and being able to like kind of slow your opponent, or prevent your opponent, but prevent yourself from being affected from what your opponent is trying to do, while you work to having a better board state or a better value state and be able to overpower your opponent from there. Fire is very much all gas, no brakes. Going to deal a lot of damage. It's going to filter a lot and basically play for make a little mini combo element. And then water is very controlling, very taxing in order to play, for these game states where your opponent is just kind of like choked out of the game, and you eventually can just close it out from there, either with a big combo element, or maybe just, finally get into a game state where they just can't quite deal even with the decent amount of pressure that you have brought to them. So that's kind of where each one sits. The cool thing about this is, if you're new to the game, is like you can pick a hero or a champion like Lorraine, and you can play her 3 different ways. You can play a fire Lorraine and just go nuts. You can play a water Lorraine and go into Crux, her other element, or you can just play an allies Lorraine and use her weapons to be able to swing wide with allies and really overpower your opponent. So there's like 3 completely separate archetypes in Lorraine to be able to do. So one champion can be played 3 completely different ways. So hopefully this made sense to you. If you want me to go more in depth, let me know. For any established Grand Archive players, if I missed a key point that you think is worth it, please let me know in the comments below. If I said something that you don't agree with, also let me know. This is just my perception of these elements, and I want to give other people that may be new to the game a better understanding of them. So any advice is welcome. But thank you all so much for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoy this type of content. If you're new to the channel, feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe. If not me, it's totally fine. Go to another creator, leave a like, comment, subscribe on their stuff so we can get more people seeing this game. And yeah, I'll see y'all next time on TCG Talk. Y'all stay safe.